the draft. It's a staple in any professional sports league, and if you want to have success in those sports leagues, you're going to need to draft well. And the Penguins, I'm not going to compare every franchise, but they've got to be towards the top of the NHL all time when it comes to draft success. Keep in mind, Gretzky was never drafted in the NHL by the Oilers. Penguins have gotten Yager, Malkin, Crosby, Lemieux. With the draft coming up at the end of the week, this will be my video going over every draft in Pittsburgh Penguins history. This will be a continuation of my every series that I have on my channel. This video will be an overview of every draft in Penguins history, but also a ranking of them. As you can see, I'm going to go over every single Penguins draft class and rank them S to F on how impactful I thought they were on the franchise. So I'm not going to be going in chronological order. I'm going to be going in F to S order. We're about to review every draft class in Penguins history, and with the franchise almost being 60 years old, we got a lot to talk about. So let's jump right in before a couple of things I want to explain before we get into it. The main thing that I'm looking for when ranking these draft classes is franchise impact. I don't care if the Penguins drafted a good player and then they traded him away to a different player, like Brandon Yeager could go be a great Winnipeg Jet. I don't care. The Penguins may have drafted him, but I only care the impact that the Penguins made. I think that goes without saying. The main statistic that I use to kind of grade these is games played. If you played for the Pittsburgh Penguins for a long time and were drafted by them, I think that's great for your draft class. That's why guys like, Brian Rust and Brooks Orpik are going to rank higher on this list than Marcus Naslund, who did play for the Penguins and had a great NHL career, but only barely played for the Penguins. My tiers are pretty self-explanatory. We have F tier, no value; D tier, little value; C tier, some value; B tier, good value; A tier, great value; and S tier, franchise changing. If you know your Penguins history, you already probably know who goes in S tier, but I actually have one more tier, and that's kind of separately, and let's just jump right in and talk about that. In the too early to tell tier, we have the draft classes of 2022, 2023, 2024, 2025, and pretty soon 2026. I think that also goes without saying why those draft classes are in the too early to tell tier. And to go over this tier real quick, I'm going to have somewhere on the screen is going to be a number, and that number is going to be the total amount of games played by those players of a draft class, Penguins draft class, for the Penguins specifically, like I mentioned. The 2022 draft featured Owen Pickering and Sergei Murashov. Pickering was the first round pick. Murashov looks like he might be the best player for the Penguins. The 23 draft isn't looking too great, with both Brandon Yeager and Emil Painaniemi both being traded out. 24 draft featured Harrison Brunick. We'll see how he develops. I'd love for him to play more NHL games this upcoming season. And then obviously last year's draft, Ben Kindle was the main show. And that draft class is still going to be in the too early to tell tier for a while now, but I think it already is up into the higher tiers with how impactful Kindle has been, and we'll see what Zonin and Horkov can do. And obviously it goes without saying, I'm hoping the 2026 draft will follow. Let's finally jump into things here with a lot of draft classes that I don't have anything to say about. Specifically, the 1967 and the 2017, so literally 50 years apart, draft classes that both featured 0 players go on to play for the Penguins. The 2008 draft class only had 1, the 1978 draft class 5, the 2016 draft class 6, but it did feature Philip Gustafson, who the Penguins traded away. He's now in Minnesota. The 1968 draft 16, the 1971 draft, only 41, and another draft class that had some notable players, Paul Laus, Jamie Hayward, but both didn't play for the Penguins. The Penguins got only 82 games worth of value out of the 89 draft. I do not have a lot to say about that entire tier, obviously, because there's literally nothing to talk about. I mean, there's some players to talk about, but they played for other franchises and everything. If you know your Penguins history, though, a lot of it kind of makes sense. You have the first couple of years of the franchise, 67, 68, 71. Then you have the cup years when the Penguins were pushing for cups and were trading for Marian Hossa in 2008 and Phil Kessel in 16 and 17 and all that stuff. It makes sense why those draft classes didn't hit as much. Let's move on to D tier, which is a little bit better. So D tier is where I have put I just got out of too early to tell, but I'm still not too good yet, but I could be in the future tier, with the 2018, 19, 20, and 21 draft classes all being here. The 2019 draft class is pretty much shut now. Sam Poulin, Nathan Legare, and Valtteri Puustinen being the notable players from that. All are on different franchises right now. 2018 barely is in this tier and not F tier because Philip Hollander is still in the Penguins organization. He was hurt last year. Similarly, Joel Blomqvist has kind of been pushed out with other goalies coming in the organization, but Blomqvist is still in the Penguins organization. We'll see what happens at this offseason, though. And then Tristan Brose has only played one NHL game, but he could still be more for the 2021 draft class. Continuing D tier, we have the 2009 draft class, whose most notable player was Simone Dupre. I remember him. It just didn't really work out with him. There's a lot of defensemen in that era where it didn't really work out, but we did get like Olli Maatta and Brian Dumoulin out of that era, so I'm happy. And also 2 cups. The 1969 draft is unfortunately here. That was the draft class that featured Michel Briere, who tragically passed away. As well as Rick Kessel. No relation to Phil, but he was a decent player back in the day. Then I kind of just have 2 draft classes that I kind of got the same vibes from. The 1979 draft and the 1994 draft. Both featured like one okay, like bottom 6 or third pairing player, being the 79 draft with Mark Chorney and the 94 draft with Richard Park. Nothing too crazy. So yeah, this video has probably been pretty boring so far because we obviously haven't been talking about any big names. So it's a tier list, so we'll start to get in here a little bit more. C tier, a little bit better. Whereas D tier had like maybe one guy who was like okay. C tier has better guys, but also more of the same type of guys, if that makes any sense. Like, they didn't just have like one random like 4th liner. They had a couple 4th liners. And I think a good example of that is the 2011 draft that had Scott Harrington, Josh Archibald, and Scott Wilson. Okay. The 2007 draft that had Dustin Jeffrey and Robert Bertuzzo. The 1987 draft that had Sean McEachern and Chris Joseph. The 1970 draft that had Greg Polis. The 1993 draft that had Hans Jonsson and Patrick Lalime, who was a great young goalie for the Penguins, and then they got rid of him. The 1985 draft that had Paul Stanton, Jimmy Pack, and Craig Simpson. The 1973 draft that had Dennis Ochar, Wayne Bianchin, and Hockey Hall of Famer Colin Campbell. He's a Hockey Hall of Famer as a builder. Then you had 2 draft classes that were back-to-back, and I can speak more on because I was, alive. 2014 and 15 draft class. The 2014 draft class had Sam Lafferty and Kasperi Kapanen as notable players. Kasperi Kapanen has an asterisk on it because he came back. Some other players came back like Recchi, but Kapanen technically never played a game for the Penguins coming out of his draft, if that makes any sense. He was traded in the Kessel deal to Toronto, and then he came back. So I didn't know how I wanted to include that, but I just kept it simple and added all of his totals. And then the 2015 draft that had Daniel Sprong and Dominic Simone. Again, these players the Penguins hoped they could be more. They really weren't, none of them. But still, the Penguins got some value out of them. I mentioned the infamous drafting of Marcus Naslund. That was in 1991. He was really the only notable player from that draft class, and then he was traded to Vancouver. 1997 had Joseph Melichar and Andrew Ferentz. 1999 had Konstantin Kolsov and Ryan Malone. 2001 had Colby Armstrong and Thomas Survey, and 1996 had Michael Roosevelt. 1977 also had Mark Johnson, Miracle on Ice player, and Greg Millen, notable Penguins goaltender. And that wraps up C tier. Moving on to B tier, which I didn't count, but I believe has the most draft classes. And our first draft class to have over 1,000 games combined by a draft class to play for the Penguins. I'll just get that out of the way right now. That was the 1981 draft class that featured Dave Hannon and Rod Buskus. I'm, in my mid-20s. I was not around back then. I'm doing my due diligence and research as a Penguins fan to learn about some of these greater players that were not on the Stanley Cup teams or anything like that were pretty good. Dave Hannon, looking at his point totals, he's not bad. And Rod Buskus also had a decent career. That draft class put up 1,106 games played combined for the Pittsburgh Penguins, and that's pretty good. At the complete opposite end of B tier in terms of games played, this draft class has the least amount of games played in this tier, and that is the 1988 draft class. There really wasn't anyone notable from this draft class except for Mark Recchi, who was a Hockey Hall of Famer and a notable Penguin, and I had to put him in this tier. So you can see how they kind of both are very different, but they're both in the same tier. The 1972 and 1974 drafts were pretty notable when the Penguins were coming into the league in the early years. In 72, they drafted the greatest goalie in franchise history at that point, Dennis Herron. In 74, they drafted Pierre LaRouche, who would go on to have some great years with the Penguins. They also drafted Mario Faubert. And the very next year, in 1974, they were able to draft both Paul Baxter and Russ Anderson, who Russ Anderson specifically went on to play some great years for the Penguins, maybe the Brian Dumoulin of the era. And then again, the next year, 1976, Greg Malone, father of Ryan Malone, and Blair Chapman were drafted. Greg Malone was a very important Penguins back in the day, but he's not remembered because didn't win cups. Penguins weren't as good back then. So getting out of the 70s, and let's talk about something that's more recent. 2006 features a player who just won the Conn Smythe, Jordan Staal, who is going to go down as a greater Hurricane than he was Penguin, but was pivotal in the 2009 Cup run for the Penguins. 1992 had really only one notable player, but that player was Martin Straka, who went on to have some great years with the Penguins. Probably one of the greatest players in franchise history that never won a cup, unfortunately. Underrated gem, Troy Loney was drafted in 1982, a decade prior. And then the year after, the Penguins drafted Bob Airey and very important backup goaltender Frank Pietrangelo. The Penguins got the piece in 1998 with Rob Scuderi, also Milan Kraft. They also drafted a defenseman in 2002, Ryan Whitney, obviously famous for spitting chicklets and for being traded for Chris Kunitz. But he had some decent years with the Penguins before they decided to move on. The Penguins also got Eric Christensen in that draft, which I'd probably put that in D tier if it was not for a late bloomer and a late prec, Max Talbot. Sticking with the defenseman theme, Brooks Orpik, one of the greatest Penguins defensemen of all time. Was drafted in the year 2000 along with Michel Oulet. And we just talked about Jordan Staal. The 2012 draft also goes in this tier, the draft where he was traded. And also sticking with the defenseman theme, the Penguins got Brian Dumoulin there, but he wasn't drafted by the Penguins. They drafted Olli Maatta and Derek Pouliot as their notable defensemen in the first round that year. As they got Teddy Bluger and Oscar Sundqvist, good bottom six forward. Teddy Bluger played more for the Penguins. And they also found a goalie by the name of Matt Murray that draft, which I think confirms it being in B tier. A lot of just random names there, looking back on that. It's such a fascinating draft. I may do a whole video on that because that draft was in Pittsburgh. Maatta, great longtime defenseman for the Penguins. Pouliot didn't work out. Matt Murray, in the long term, didn't work out, but for 2 years in the playoffs and winning cups, absolutely, we'll take it. And then even Teddy Bluger in that draft. Crazy interesting draft there. It goes in B tier. Jordan Staal getting traded on his wedding day also happened that day, too. Speaking of a fascinating trade story, Mike Bullard got traded after he, half-assed it in practice. He was drafted in the 1980 draft and was a pretty important Penguin pre-Lemieux. Bullard was also drafted with Doug Shedden in 1980. During the Lemieux years, Rob Brown was a great line mate and spark plug player that could play anywhere in the lineup. He was drafted in 86 along with Zarley Zalapsky. And finally wrapping up the enormous B tier is the 1995 draft. That featured the likes of Alexei Morozov, Jean-Sebastien Aubin, and Jan Hrdina. That is pretty much the majority of Penguins draft classes other than the big ones. I really tried to separate A tier and S tier into the truly elite draft classes. With the Penguins, we know what's going to be in the truly elite. The A tier, though, any other team in the league would be their S tier, let's be honest here. Because there's only 7 draft classes left that we have to talk about. In A tier, a draft class that featured 727 games played for the Penguins is the 2003 draft class. That featured the legendary Paul Bissonnette and the Penguins trading up to get Marc-Andre Fleury, who would go on to be their greatest goalie in franchise history. There's going to be a lot of just stuff I don't even need to say. I don't even need to explain who these players are with these last couple of ones, so I'm not even going to try. Marc-Andre Fleury. Next. I put this draft class in here because I wanted to, and I will fight that this one deserves to be here as well. The 2010 draft class that featured the legendary Bo Bennett, as well as Tom Kuhnackel, but Brian Rust is going to go down and is already one of the greatest Pittsburgh Penguins players of all time. Look at the stats and whatever, and obviously he was on the Cup teams. Put it all together, that draft class has 1,007 games played as of right now because Russ is going to stay, and I hope he retires as a Penguin. And his former line mate, Jake Guentzel, was drafted in 2013, but not just him. And I know people don't like this guy, and he's traded to Edmonton, but Tristan Jarry was drafted that year as well. And Jarry, statistically speaking or whatever, you can have his thoughts on how he played in the playoffs, but he's one of the greatest goalies in Penguins history. There's not many. But he spent years with the franchise. He was an all-star. But Jake Guentzel, I'd probably honestly put 2013 in A tier just for Jake Guentzel. In S tier, we have 1990, Ian Moran, Chris Tamer, and a guy by the name of Jaromir Jagr. In S tier, we have 2004 with Nick Johnson, Alex Goligoski, Tyler Kennedy, and a guy by the name of Evgeny Malkin. In S tier, we have 1984 with Doug Bodger and a guy by the name of Mario Lemieux. And I know that this video and tier list is meant to be a tier list, but if I had to pick the greatest draft class in Pittsburgh Penguins history, I don't think it's controversial to say that 2006 is it. For a pretty simple reason. You got Crosby and Letang and Joe Vitale. But I would have to think there would not be another draft class to one specific franchise where players have played the most games for that franchise. You know what I'm trying to say here? Crosby and Letang together, that's over 2,000 games. And as of right now, you're sitting at 2,818 games. And while Mario is the greatest player in Penguins history, putting Crosby and Letang and Joe Vitale together, that's without a doubt the greatest draft class in Penguins history. So, just for fun, I smeared off a little bit of the board so we can make a lineup here, just for fun. What would the Penguins' all-time team look like if you could only incorporate players that were drafted by them? It'd still be pretty good. My first line is Mark Recchi, Mario, and Yogs. My second line should be familiar. It's Jake Gensel, Sidney Crosby, and Brian Rust. I wanted Malkin to play center. And he is centering Martin Straka and Mike Bullard. And the fourth line features Rob Brown, Jordan Stahl, which completes our Conn Smythe winner 1-4 center quadruplet, and Bob Airey. The defense isn't as great. You got Orpik and Letang. You got Scuderi and Ian Moran. And then you got Rod Buskus and Olli Maatta. In goal, you got Flower. And I put Jari. It should be Murray. It's Murray. I'm sorry. I put Jari in my notes because I went by like games played when I made that, but it's Murray. That was all for fun. That's for fun. But I'm very excited for the draft because I really like what Dubas is doing. I'm not going to get into current events too much, my current thoughts on the team, but let's see if he can do what he did last year and get a good player. The Penguins overall have it's a mixed bag. Like, it's easy to say they've had a great draft history, but they've also been gifted like the first overall pick and got Malkin second overall and found Jagr, and Jagr would only play for the Penguins and things like that. They traded up to get Fleury, so they're lucky to get those picks. But in terms of drafting and developing players, the greatest players I would say that would come out of that would be like, Orpik, Gensel, Rust, Matt Murray, and maybe even Ben Kindle. I want the Penguins obviously to be good, and that includes them drafting and developing players, and the draft is obviously important in doing so. Thank you guys all for watching. Who do you want the Penguins to draft here? I don't know when I'll post this video, but I'm trying to get it out before the draft. Thank you guys all for watching. Go draft, go Penguins.